You randomize them to taper or no taper, about 25% of people will have a recurrence of depression over 18 months. If you leave them on them, approximately 10% will have a recurrence of depression. So it shows you that about 10 to 15% of people are actually getting a benefit from it, but 75% aren't. And we also know that the evidence is fairly clear that about half the people can just stop these drugs without any problem, but about half of them have withdrawal symptoms, and about, probably a half of that half are quite severe. It takes a long time to get people off these medications, and you have to do it relatively slowly with small changes in the dose. And I think the reason that people are going to Facebook is because we've done a terrible job of telling people that this is a potential thing to do. And when you have 50% of people going through withdrawal when you stop them, there's going to be a lot of people on Facebook that are saying, boy, this has been tough. So that's my very long take on it.
If only we had a frontline clinician on the call with us tonight, James. Let's go over to him now.
Well, you're spot on.
What, you are a frontline clinician?
Yeah, you see all of that. Every day I'm talking to people who are either trying to come off or have had problems with, and electric shock in the head is the way that most people describe it. The symptom that they get most and they really notice, particularly if they haven't been able to get their prescription filled and they off for a few days, and they're really noticing it. And so, like you say, it's a bit like when you said about starting drugs, starting with the lowest dose. You're saying the evidence says 50%, but for some patients, you can stop it relatively quickly if they haven't been on it very long. But for others, I've got patients who, I'm holding their hand to come off those things over months and years.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, you're exactly right.
And you mentioned earlier, James, just before about how the immunoglycosides, how, if you say something enough or it's practiced enough, it's believed. So I qualified a few years after Jamie and Steve, but not that many. And So fluoxetine was the big drug then, and it was massively marketed on the fact that it didn't have dependence and withdrawal effects, and was for years. So I must admit, I find it hard to change my mindset on that issue, even hearing everything you've just said then and reading these papers and seeing it firsthand. It's a real bias, isn't it, that we still have this sort of mindset that drugs like this don't have withdrawal effects. And so I'm guessing if you're a busy GP faced with a patient who's got depression or other issues, and you've got no other options because there's no mental services to refer them to, the after effects aren't on your mind at that point of prescribing. I doubt you're thinking about withdrawal at that point of prescribing.
I totally agree with you. The interesting part about it is, though, I think it's really important, and again, this almost goes back to the thing that I was talking about with that Noam Chomsky book, is even the word depression is not a good one. I know a colleague in New Zealand that I've done some work with, Bruce Earle. He's a great researcher in primary care. He said we have to stop using the word depression. I mean, it's so label oriented. He said, and I think it's a brilliant word to use, is you're stuck, aren't you? You're stuck on something. Whatever it is, you're stuck, and we need to get you unstuck. I think healthcare providers need to know the benefit of these antidepressants is about 1 in 10. And all you have to do is then you need to be very fully aware of the side effects. We just talked about withdrawal of side effects, withdrawal symptoms. People get side effects from being on them. I mean, sexual dysfunction with these medications, I think the number in women is around 30%. And if you just even look at the list of the withdrawal symptoms, I mean, it's awful. And I think we need to be so careful with this. And one of the things, the messages that I think are really important is we should never put a person on an antidepressant in the first visit. And that, you guys know as well as I do, that happens a lot. I don't think it happens all the time, but there are so many other things we can do for people who are stuck. Exercise is just as effective. Now, I understand exercise and activity is not always possible for everybody, and when you're stuck or depressed, you don't feel like doing it.
You might not have heard the episode, and some of the listeners might not, but if you haven't, I would suggest you all go back and listen to Dr. Karen Sankey, who was, I think, episode 3 in series 2, who's a GP who works with the homeless, but she talks a lot about, as you've just described, she didn't use the word stuck, but she was saying that she felt helpless as a GP because all she had was her pen to be able to prescribe an antidepressant, and she knew damn well that for a lot of those people that wasn't the right answer.
Yeah. Another cool thing around being stuck or depressed is to create realistic goals. And again, this is stealing from my friend and colleague Bruce, who said, have the patient identify something that they are likely going to be able to do. If it is, I haven't had the energy to go outside the house, you might say, well, is there at least a 70% chance that you could do that one time this week? Because if they can't say it's 70 or 80%, you're going to set them up for failure. So you identify the thing that they say, I think I'm likely to do. But if they say it's only 10% chance, they're just going to fail and be more stuck or depressed. And so, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Paul, but go ahead.
No, that's fine. So in last week's episode, we talked to Sally Lewis, who talked about value-based healthcare and how you can spread that investment across the system in a better way. I think one of the pieces of work that was referenced in those papers was the Public Health England analysis in 2018, and it showed that antidepressants were prescribed for 7.3 million people in the UK, or that might even be England, I think. So that's 17% of the adult population had an antidepressant. And so what Sally talked about was we invest in the wrong areas of the chain. I'm sure it's the same over the pond. There's a chronic underinvestment in counselling services, in mental health support, in psychology support and stuff. And so we invest all our money in the drugs, and not, which you've described very well as, not that great, and not at all in the talking services, where I think we've got a far better evidence base for. So it's another example of what Sally was talking about, the investment being in the wrong place.
Yeah, and like a pill is an easy fix. And to tell you the truth, I mean, if I was, I don't know, depressed or anxious or whatever, and there was a pill I could take and it had no side effects and no cost, I would take it, because a pill is easy to take. A colleague of mine who I learned a lot from as I was getting into practice is a drug without a side effect is a drug without an effect. I think we need to be aware of that as an issue when it comes to medications, especially when it comes to drugs like the SSRIs, for which we have no clue how they work. But we do know they affect oodles of different neurotransmitters in your body, and then we go, holy cow, that's surprising that it was difficult to get off.
Gimmo's mentioned the Sally Lewis episode. Sally's book was Reckoning with Risk, James, and I mentioned that the first chapter that changed my teaching because I put a lot of scenarios in, but one of them I remember changing at the time, and it was the Prozac example of sexual dysfunction. And it says, only then did the psychiatrist realise that he had never checked how his patients understood what a 30 to 50% chance of developing a sexual problem meant. It turned out that many of them had thought that something would go awry in 30 to 50% of their sexual encounters. For years, my friend had simply not noticed what he intended to say was not what his patients heard.
Yeah, well, I've got a great example of that where, I can't remember, it was antibiotics or whatever I was talking about, and I said, the chance of diarrhea is about 10%. There's more than just one person who thought that meant every 10 times I go to the bathroom, I get diarrhea. And so that in and of itself is, I'm doing the best I can to give numbers and talk about side effects. But, here's a wonderful, I think it's an example that we should take from this is we were always trained as healthcare providers. Let's say if you're going to use is it Ventolin in your country, or is it
salbutamol? Yeah.
Salbutamol, and is we always are told, show a person how to use an inhaler and then get them to show it to you, because the first time you show it, they just can't do it. And so we need to do the same thing. Is that when we explain evidence, because as well as I do, when you've got a person, they go they have got a clue what you're talking about. And I tried to do this all the time and say, what did I just say? And I don't mean that derogatory. Just tell me what you think I just said. But as well as I do, half the time I got to redo it.
Look, I'm going to throw one more at you, James, and it might be, it's a slight curveball, but it is antidepressant related, because I learned a lot from this gentleman over antidepressants, and in particular, the influence of the pharmaceutical industry. Professor David Healy, do you remember when David came over to Canada?
Yeah, no, I know. Yeah.
And so I learned a lot from David, because he used to do a session on how a depressed woman was portrayed by the pharmaceutical industry over the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and in their marketing campaign. And it was very clever the way that he put that together to show, look, this is what we're being sold here. This is what a depressed woman looks like in the 1970s. And now, look, this is a depressed woman in the 90s. And it was very clever.
Yeah, and again, if you owned a business, you would do exactly what drug companies do. You would promote, hopefully is not doing something illegal, but you would promote it just like that. You'd get to that edge as much as possible. So we cannot blame the drug companies. They are intimately involved with the problem. But as a colleague of mine once said, when it came to using the latest and greatest, no drug company has ever put a gun to my head and told me to prescribe. And again, this is not to blame healthcare providers or us. It's a systemic problem. And I think we need a systemic solution to this, and it will not come from siloing pharmacists or nurses or other healthcare providers. It's about all of us working together in conjunction with patients, and we are all going to become patients at some point. So we need a system to be better than what we have. It's not awful, but it's got a lot of room for improvement.
Okay, a big thank you to James for joining us on The Oral Apothecary and for sharing his stories, his desert island drug and his career anthem, and a book for the Oral Apothecary Library. Coming up next time, we'll be joined by Dr. Diane Ashuru. Diane is lead pharmacist for the Antimicrobial Resistance Programme at the UK Health Security Agency, that's Public Health England in old money, and chair of the UK Antibiotic Guardian campaign. We look forward to catching up with Diane next time on Oral Apothecary. You can contact us via Twitter at Oral Apothecary. We're on LinkedIn, and you can email us at oralapothecarypod@gmail.com. Over to Gimmo for the final ingredient.
Thanks, James. That was fantastic. It was last week, I think on Tuesday, was International Pharmacy Technician Day. Who's the most famous pharmacy technician?
Oh, good question. Is it Sam that we had on in Series 1?
The goat.
No, so Agatha Christie. During the First World War, Agatha Christie, who was a nurse, took a break from nursing to train from the Apothecaries Hall examination. She actually found dispensing in the hospital pharmacy monotonous and less enjoyable than nursing, but her new knowledge provided with her a background in potentially toxic drugs. There are many medical practitioners, pharmacists and scientists in Christie's cast of characters, so check out Murder in Mesopotamia, Cards on the Table, The Pale Horse, or Mrs. McGinty's Dead, and there's drugs that feature in all of them. So she said, I'm more interested in peaceful people who die in their own beds and no one knows why. She used drugs such as arsenic, aconite, strychnine, digitalis, thallium, and other substances. So there you go, Agatha Christie's The Fourth Apothecary.
This was a 3 Apothecaries production. Sound engineer Jimbo Slough. Original music Jamie Brewster. Artwork by David Baker.
Thanks for listening to the Oral Apothecary Podcast. Warning, harmless if digested.
This episode of the Oral Apothecary is sponsored by OneLessPill.com, a medicines optimization consultancy.